The following is an excerpt from this book called Letter to the American Church by Eric Metaxas. Here we go. Part of this may be traced back to the 1960s, when the U.S. Supreme Court took power out of the public schools. But the problem is less this specific action than what it represented and portended. It was part of a general trend down a path that was fundamentally mistaken in its views of Jefferson's famous, quote, wall of separation between church and state. Rather than protecting people of faith from government intrusion, as the founders intended, which is of course the central idea of what we call religious liberty, the judiciary instead began to interpret it to mean that the public square should be stripped of faith entirely. The Reverend Richard John Niehaus famously called this the creation of the naked public square, which was the perfect opposite of the founders' intentions. And it must be said emphatically that to secularize the public square is actually to impose upon it a religion of another kind, albeit in a way that very cleverly and dishonestly pretends not to be religious at all. But on matters that touch on the fundamentals of human existence, especially with regard to such institutions as marriage and the sanctity of life, we are inescapably dealing with religious issues. So to stand against the views of the people of faith is, quite ironically, but unavoidably, to take a distinctly religious view nonetheless, and to seek to impose it. And so the Supreme Court and the federal government, which are expressly forbidden from putting a thumb on the scales, but who are to allow the American people to exercise their wills and to have freedom in all things, began to impose their secular views. The justices did this most infamously when, in 1973, they purported to discover in the Constitution a, quote, right to abortion, where of course none existed or ever could exist. In the decades since that time, they continued to drift farther behind their ordained judicial orbit and have sometimes legislated unconstitutionally from the bench. So, because the American people did not sufficiently see the dangers of this, and because Christian leaders did not speak out boldly, the drift toward an unconstitutional and secular view began to be enshrined in our laws and in our culture. We must go back to the mid-1950s to understand what happened. It was in 1954 that then Senator Lyndon Johnson introduced an amendment to the U.S. tax code prohibiting churches and any other nonprofit organizations from taking a public stand on political candidates. If anyone from a pulpit dared to endorse a candidate, that church's tax exemption would be repealed. It is astonishing that pastors in America allowed this wild idea to go uncontested. I'm going to say that again. It is astonishing that pastors in America allowed this wild idea to go uncontested. In this, they behaved rather like many of the submissive pastors in Germany 2 decades earlier. Of course, for American pastors to submit meekly to anything like this is far more shocking, given our own history of religious liberty and freedom of speech. As a result of these and other events, a pall was cast over many churches, and faith over time began to be privatized, to recede from the public sphere and from being applied to issues that went beyond mere theology and personal pietism. And this erroneous view became increasingly normalized. Let's see, where did I just leave off? I had to scratch an itch behind my ear. Let's see. Pietism normalized. Okay. I'm going to read that last little part again. As a result of these and other events, a pall was cast over many churches, and faith over time began to be privatized, to recede from the public sphere and from being applied to issues that went beyond mere theology and personal pietism, and this erroneous view became increasingly normalized. But it is an inescapable and painful fact: if the churches in America are not free to speak on any topic, let's just say this one again. It is an inescapable and painful fact: if the churches in America are not free to speak on any topic and in any way that they choose, and if they voluntarily go along with this view, then no one in America is truly free. And America herself has effectively ceased to exist. We have to just see how outrageous it is that this has indeed happened. How could the government, in putting forth the so-called Johnson Amendment, dare to draw any lines around what could be said in a sermon in which God's own word is to be delivered? What could conceivably be more deserving of complete freedom than that form of all forms of public speech? And if the conscience of the man of God in that pulpit would cause him to speak for or against a candidate, what is that to the U.S. government? In fact, it is none of its business. Have we forgotten that pastors in the 18th century spoke boldly from their colonial pulpits against the tyranny of King George III and opposed him by name? Was it not their voices that helped us to gain our freedoms and that helped us to create a constitution in which all of our freedoms were enshrined in a way that has been the envy of the whole world ever since? Were pastors from their American pulpits in the 19th century not allowed to speak against those candidates who expressed racist and pro-slavery views? Did they not even have an obligation to educate their congregations on such things and to encourage them to choose leaders who shared God's views? Finally, were pastors in the 20th century not allowed to speak out against candidates who advocated for Jim Crow laws? Do we think they ought to have been? This is no way for any Christian, much less a pastor, to parse what he may be, quote, allowed to say. and certainly not from the pulpit. It can only be God and our consciences guided by Him that can determine what we should and shouldn't say. So our total freedom in and beyond our pulpits is non-negotiable. The truth cannot be contained, and certainly not in categories that have been arbitrarily chosen and defined by others. So when did these pernicious ideas come into American churches? Perhaps the more important question is, why did Christian leaders submit to these un-Christian and un-American ideas? And why are they submitting to them today? Have so many pastors today really forgotten that it is God who calls them to their posts and God who fills their churches and keeps them filled? Have they forgotten what the scriptures say, that if they honor God, He will honor them? Has keeping an eye on the bottom line and on the numbers and attendance caused them to drift away from the very reason God called them to the pulpit in the first place? Have they become like the leaders of American corporations who have become especially cowardly and seem willing to say and do whatever someone advises them is necessary to avoid trouble and keep them from being called canceled? Have the blessings we have in America made us so comfortable and so soft that we have forgotten that God expects us to serve Him with everything we have, and that if we are in leadership, He requires us to understand that our greater position of authority comes with even greater expectations? Of course, many American pastors probably never had this kind of heroic faith to begin with. And there are some who once had it, but who over time have lost their first love and drifted to that awful point at which they are in danger of judgment. Just as the German Christians in the 1930s and just as the Christians in Ephesus in the first century were. Will those among us who have lost our first love repent before it's too late? There are a host of reasons and excuses for the behavior of many pastors and Christian leaders, and we will touch on them as we go forward because many of them are the same reasons and excuses given by German pastors in the 1930s. But the language of many contemporary American Christians is different than that of the German pastors of the 1930s in one principal respect. The American Christians of our own time have taken to using the term, quote, the gospel, in a new way, as though by doing this they hope to set religious and theological issues apart from all else, as though this were possible. And so now, when many American church leaders shrink from taking a particular stand, they often say that they are doing so, quote, for the sake of the gospel. It is, quote, for the sake of the gospel that we will not contest these things, they say, that we will assiduously avoid taking sides in these terribly divisive, quote, culture wars, and we will even more assiduously avoid being identified with any political party or candidate. The idea is that anything that might conceivably be accused of, quote, being political is manifestly out of bounds. But how can we have come to this bizarre pass? If there are injustices done to our fellow Americans, are we not to protest and, if necessary, even fight politically for what is right? Thanks for listening.